Chapter 1. They laughed when he walked onto the field. They laughed when he walked onto the field. Not because he was famous. Not because he had scored 100 goals. They laughed because, to them, he did not belong there. The stadium was packed that night. Thousands of people filled the seats, waving flags, shouting, and waiting for the biggest match of the tournament to begin. The lights were brighter than anything he had ever seen. The cameras were everywhere. And for the first time in his life, the entire world was watching. But he was standing alone near the edge of the field. His name was Daniel Carter, 23 years old, a substitute player nobody expected to see. A player most people had already forgotten. Even the commentators barely mentioned his name. Daniel Carter, still waiting for his opportunity, one of them said. The other laughed quietly. Some players wait their whole lives for a moment like this, but honestly, I'm not sure he's ready for this level. Daniel heard every word. He heard the laughter from the stands. He heard the whispers from the bench. And then he saw them. 3 players from his old academy. The same players who had laughed at him years ago. The same players who had told him he would never become a professional. One of them looked toward the field and smiled. Then he pointed at Daniel. The others laughed. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He simply looked down at his boots. Those boots were old. The leather was cracked. The color had faded. But he still wore them, because they were the same boots his father had given him when he was 14 years old. His father had once told him, "People can laugh at your dream, Daniel, but they cannot take it away from you." Daniel had believed those words for almost 10 years. Even when his teammates were selected before him. Even when coaches told him he was too small, too slow, too ordinary. Even when his own friends stopped believing in him. He kept training. Every morning. Every night. When other players went home, Daniel stayed. When the stadium lights turned off, he continued running. And when nobody was watching, he practiced the same shot. Again, and again, and again. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was no longer training in an empty field. Tonight, he was standing inside the biggest stadium of his life. And there were only 12 minutes left in the match. The score was tied. One goal would change everything. The coach looked toward the bench. Daniel immediately looked away. He had waited for this moment for years. But now that it was finally here, he was terrified. Then suddenly, the captain fell to the ground. The stadium went silent. The coach stood up. The 4th official raised the substitution board. And Daniel saw the number. His number. For a few seconds, he did not move. The coach shouted his name. Daniel. He looked up. Get ready. Daniel stood. The crowd began to cheer. Some people cheered because they knew him. Most of them did not. As he walked toward the field, the cameras followed him. And the same people who had laughed at him years ago were now watching. Daniel stepped across the white line. The referee looked at him. The crowd roared. And somewhere in the stadium, someone whispered, "He's going to change the game." But nobody knew the truth. Nobody knew what Daniel had sacrificed to reach this moment. Nobody knew what had happened to his father. And nobody knew that this was not just a football match for Daniel. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. The referee blew the whistle. Daniel took his first step forward. And then, the ball came toward him. The entire stadium held its breath. Because sometimes, the person everyone laughs at is the person who has been waiting the longest to prove them wrong. And Daniel Carter had been waiting for 10 years. Chapter 2, the boy nobody believed in. The ball rolled toward Daniel. Slowly, almost gently, but to him, it felt like the entire world was moving in slow motion. One touch, That was all he needed. One touch to control the ball. One touch to prove he belonged. But the defender was already running toward him. Fast. Daniel looked up. The stadium was loud. The crowd was screaming. The pressure was enormous. And for one brief second, Daniel was 14 years old again, standing on a dusty field behind his father's workshop, wearing the same old boots, watching other boys play. He remembered the day he first told his father that he wanted to become a professional footballer. His father had looked at him, then looked at his worn-out shoes, and smiled, not because he thought the dream was impossible, but because he knew how difficult the road would be. "Then you better be ready to work harder than everyone else," his father had said. Daniel nodded. "I will." And he did. Every morning before school. Every afternoon after school. Every night when the streets became quiet. Daniel trained. While other boys played for fun, Daniel trained like his life depended on it. But talent was not the only thing he needed. He needed money. And his family did not have much. His father repaired old machines in a small workshop. His mother worked long hours at a local restaurant. There were months when the family struggled to pay the bills. And football was expensive. New boots, training fees, travel, tournaments, everything cost money. One day, Daniel came home with a letter. He had been selected for an important academy trial. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for. But there was one problem. The trial was in another city, and his family could not afford the journey. Daniel placed the letter on the table. His father read it quietly. Then he looked at his son. "How much will it cost?" Daniel lowered his eyes. "Too much." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then his father stood up. The next morning, Daniel saw his father selling his old truck. The truck he had used for work for almost 15 years. Daniel was shocked. "Dad, you can't sell that." His father smiled. "I can, but how will you work?" His father placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. Sometimes, a father has to believe in his son before his son learns how to believe in himself. Daniel never forgot those words. He went to the trial, and he made the team. But the dream did not become easier. The academy was full of talented players. Players with expensive boots. Players with famous coaches. Players whose parents had connections. Daniel had none of that. He only had his work ethic. And his father's old boots. At first, the other players ignored him. Then they started laughing. "Where did you get those shoes? Are those even football boots? Maybe you should go back to your village." Daniel said nothing. He trained, but one player laughed louder than the others. His name was Marcus Reed. Marcus was the academy's star player. Everyone loved him. The coaches trusted him. And he hated Daniel. Because Daniel never stopped working. One afternoon after training, Marcus walked over to him. "You know you will never make it, right?" Daniel looked at him. "Make what?" "The professional team." Marcus laughed. "You don't have the talent." Daniel looked down at his boots. Then he looked back at Marcus. "Maybe." Marcus smiled. "Good, at least you understand." But Daniel did not tell him the truth. He did not need Marcus to believe in him. He only needed himself to keep going. Years passed. Marcus became a professional player. Daniel did not. Marcus received contracts. Daniel received rejection letters. Again, and again, and again. Every time Daniel came close. Something went wrong. An injury. A failed trial. A coach who chose someone else. A team that said he was not good enough. Eventually, people stopped asking about his dream. They assumed he had given up. But Daniel never did. He simply stopped telling people about it. And now, 10 years later, he was standing on the biggest field of his life. The defender was only a few feet away. The crowd was screaming. Daniel took his first touch. Perfect. The ball stayed close to his foot. The defender moved in. Daniel turned. And for the first time that night, the entire stadium became quiet. Because something had changed. The player everyone thought was nervous wasn't nervous anymore. Daniel looked toward the goal, and he saw Marcus Reed, standing in the path ahead of him. The same Marcus who had laughed at him. The same Marcus who had told him he would never make it. Now wearing the captain's armband. Daniel and Marcus looked at each other. For 1 second, neither of them moved. Then Marcus smiled. The same smile Daniel remembered from 10 years ago.
The cheering, everything became silent. His father was missing, and somewhere at home there was a letter waiting for him. A letter his father had written 10 years ago. Daniel looked back at the field where he had just scored the goal of his life. Then he looked at the empty stands, and suddenly he realized something. His father had not been watching tonight by accident. He had known this moment was coming. The question was how, and what exactly had his father been hiding from him? Chapter 4. The letter from 10 years ago. Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his car outside his parents' house. The engine was off. The street was quiet, but inside his mind everything was screaming. His father had been missing for 3 days, and somewhere inside that house, there was a letter written 10 years ago. Daniel looked at the house. The lights were on. His mother was waiting inside. He finally opened the car door and walked toward the front entrance. The moment he stepped inside, his mother hugged him. She held him tightly, but Daniel could feel her shaking. "Mom," she pulled away. Her eyes were red. "Where is Dad?" His mother looked toward the hallway. Then she whispered, "I don't know." Daniel stared at her. "What do you mean you don't know? He left 3 days ago." "Where did he go?" She shook her head. "He didn't tell me." Daniel's heart began to beat faster. "Did he leave a message?" His mother looked down. "Yes." Daniel froze. "What did it say?" His mother walked slowly toward the kitchen. She opened a drawer. Then she pulled out a small envelope. It was old. Very old. The paper had turned yellow. The edges were worn. And written across the front was Daniel's name. Daniel took 1 step forward. His hands began to shake. "That's the letter." His mother nodded. "Your father gave it to me 10 years ago." Daniel stared at the envelope. "Why didn't you give it to me before?" His mother looked at him. "Because he told me not to." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Why?" His mother took a deep breath. "He said you weren't ready." Daniel almost laughed. "Ready for what?" His mother did not answer. Daniel took the envelope. He turned it over. There was no return address, no explanation, only his name, Daniel Carter. He carefully opened it. Inside there was a single piece of paper. He unfolded it and began to read. The first line made him stop. "Daniel," he continued, "if you are reading this letter." Daniel's breathing became slower. "Then something has happened." He looked at his mother. She was crying again. Daniel continued reading. "I have watched you chase the same dream for 10 years. I have watched you fail. I have watched you stand back up. And I need you to know something." Daniel stopped. His hands were trembling. He read the next line. "You were never the reason I sold the truck." Daniel froze. He looked up. "What?" His mother closed her eyes. Daniel looked back at the letter. He continued, "I told you I sold the truck to pay for your academy trial." Daniel's face changed, but that was not the real reason. Daniel's heart began to pound. He read the next sentence. "The truth is." There was a long pause. Daniel's eyes moved across the page, and then he saw it, the sentence that changed everything. "I sold the truck because I had no other choice." Daniel slowly lowered the letter. His mother covered her mouth. "Mom." Daniel looked at her. "What does this mean?" She said nothing. Daniel looked back at the paper. There was more. He continued reading. 10 years ago, I made a promise to someone." Daniel frowned. "A promise that changed our entire family. I promised that I would never tell you the truth about your birth." Daniel stopped breathing. The letter fell from his hands. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. Daniel stared at his mother. She looked away. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper. "Who am I?" His mother began to cry. Daniel took a step backward. "Who am I?" His mother finally looked at him, and the words came out slowly. "Your father." She stopped. Daniel waited. "Your father was not your biological father." Daniel stood frozen. The house seemed to disappear around him. The walls, the furniture, the lights, everything. For 23 years, he had believed one man was his father. The man who had raised him. The man who had sacrificed everything for him. The man who had sold his truck for his dream. But now a letter written 10 years ago was telling him that everything he knew about his life was a lie. Daniel looked down at the letter. At the bottom, There was one final sentence. A sentence his father had written but never explained. Your real father is still alive. Daniel looked up. His mother was crying, and outside, a car suddenly stopped in front of the house. Daniel turned toward the window. A man stepped out. He was older, tall, and wearing a dark coat. Daniel had never seen him before, but the moment his mother saw the man, she stopped crying. Her face turned pale. Daniel looked at her. Mom. She whispered one word. Run. Final chapter. The truth behind the dream. Daniel did not run. He stood in the middle of the room staring at the man outside. His mother grabbed his arm. Daniel, we have to go. But Daniel pulled away. No. His mother looked at him. What do you mean? No. I want to know who he is. The man outside slowly walked toward the front door. Daniel's heart was beating faster. His mother whispered, you don't understand. Then explain it to me. She looked at the letter in his hand. Then she closed her eyes. Your father knew this day would come. Daniel froze. My father, the man who raised you. Daniel looked toward the door. He knew. His mother nodded. Everything. A knock came from the front door. 3 slow knocks. Daniel looked at his mother. She was terrified. The knocking came again, this time harder. Daniel walked toward the door. His mother grabbed him. Don't. Daniel stopped. Why? She looked into his eyes. Because the man outside is the reason your real father disappeared. Daniel's blood ran cold. What? His mother began to cry. 23 years ago. Your biological father was involved with dangerous people. Daniel stared at her. He was a criminal. No. She shook her head. He was a journalist. Daniel said nothing. His mother continued. He discovered a powerful secret, a secret that could destroy important people, and when he tried to expose the truth, he disappeared. Daniel looked toward the door, and the man outside. His mother whispered, he was the last person who saw your real father alive. Daniel's hands tightened around the letter. Then why is he here? His mother looked at him. Because he knows where your real father is. Daniel felt his entire world change again. The man knocked one more time. Daniel slowly opened the door. The man stood outside. He looked at Daniel for a long moment. Then he said, you look exactly like him. Daniel stared at him. Who are you? The man looked past him and saw Daniel's mother. For a moment nobody spoke. Then the man said, my name is Thomas. Daniel looked at his mother. Do you know him? She nodded. Thomas reached into his coat. Daniel immediately stepped back, but Thomas pulled out an old photograph. He held it toward Daniel. Daniel took it, and the moment he saw the picture his hands began to shake. There were 3 people in the photograph. His mother, a young man, and a little boy. Daniel, the young man, was holding him. Daniel stared at the face. He had never seen him before, but somehow he felt familiar. That's your father, his mother whispered. Daniel looked at the photograph. Where is he? Thomas looked down. Then he said, he is alive. Daniel stopped breathing. What? Thomas looked toward the road. He has been living under another name for 23 years. Why? Because the people who wanted him did never stopped looking for him. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Then why didn't he come back? Thomas looked at his mother. She lowered her head. And finally the truth came out. Because I asked him not to. Daniel looked at her. What? She began to cry. I was afraid. For you. For me. For everyone. Daniel took a step backward. All these years. His voice broke. You knew. His mother nodded. I knew he was alive. Daniel looked down at the letter. His father had known too. The man who raised him had known everything. And still he had stayed. Still, he had sacrificed everything. Still he had believed in Daniel. Daniel suddenly understood. The letter was not about blood. It was about love. The man who raised him had never been his biological father, but he had been his father in every way that mattered. He had been there when Daniel took his first steps. He had been there when Daniel played his first match. He had been there when everyone else said, give up. And now he was gone. Daniel looked at Thomas. Where is he? Thomas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small piece of paper, an address. Daniel stared at it. Then he looked at his mother. I'm going. His mother began to cry. I know. The next morning, Daniel drove for 6 hours, away from the stadium, away from the cameras, away from the people who had suddenly started calling him a hero. He drove toward a small town near the coast. The address led him to a quiet house. Daniel stepped out of the car. For a few seconds he simply stood there. Then he walked toward the door. He knocked. Nothing happened. He knocked again. Still nothing. Daniel slowly reached for the handle. The door opened. Inside the house was empty. There was only one chair, one table, and one photograph. Daniel walked toward it. The photograph showed him as a child, standing beside the man who raised him. Daniel picked it up. Behind the photograph there was a message. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see your greatest goal. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He turned around, and then he saw someone standing in the doorway. An older man. His hair was gray. His face was tired, but his eyes were exactly the same as Daniel's. Daniel stopped breathing. The man looked at him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the man said, you finally made it. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He walked forward. Dad. The man nodded. And Daniel finally understood. The goal he had scored the night before was not the greatest moment of his life. The greatest moment was standing in front of the man he had spent 23 years believing was dead. Daniel hugged him, and for the first time in his life, he felt like a missing piece had finally returned. But there was one more thing he needed to do. 3 days later, Daniel returned to the stadium. The cameras were waiting. The reporters were waiting. Everyone wanted to know about the mysterious story behind his sudden rise. But Daniel did not talk about fame. He did not talk about the goal. He simply walked onto the field and looked toward the stands. His biological father was sitting there. His mother was sitting beside him. And in Daniel's hand was the old letter. The letter that had changed everything. Daniel looked at the camera. Then he said, "People spend their whole lives trying to prove others wrong." He paused. But eventually, you realize that the only person you ever needed to prove anything to was yourself. The stadium became silent. Daniel looked down at his old boots, the same boots his father had given him years ago. Then he smiled, because now he finally understood. The world had laughed at him. The world had doubted him. The world had told him he did not belong. But none of that mattered, because the people who truly believed in him had never stopped believing. Not for 1 second. And sometimes, the person standing quietly on the sidelines is not waiting for someone to save him. He is waiting for his moment. And when that moment finally comes, the people who laugh the loudest are often the first ones to go silent. Daniel Carter had waited 10 years. 10 years of rejection. 10 years of failure. 10 years of doubt. But in the end he did not just win a football match. He found his family. He found the truth. And most importantly, he found himself. Because the world may decide your worth before it ever gives you a chance. But you get to decide whether you believe them. And sometimes all it takes is one more step onto the field.